Hi, everyone. This is Claire Potter. I promised you a conversation with Eladio Bobadilla today. I see, Eladio, you are joined as a member of the audience. I'm going to send you another invitation to join us as a co-host. We'll see if that pops up for you. But I wanted to start and not keep everybody waiting for this special edition of the Political Junkie Substack. We're here to talk about the recent revelations about Cesar Chavez. And I'm going to hope Eladio gets in this conversation because he is an expert on the United Farm Workers Movement. He has a book coming out at the end of April called Dangerous Migration, Mexican Labor and the Fight for Immigrant Rights. You can pre-order this book when this is posted to the Political Junkie Substack. I will include a link to pre-order the book. Pre-orders are incredibly important because it tells the press there's a whole excited audience out there. But Eladio, just to give you a little sense of his background, won what the Herbert Gutman Prize in Labor History for his dissertation. And this, I believe, is a revision of the dissertation, which is usually what first books are for historians. And I'm hoping we can get him in to talk about the revelations about Chavez. For those of you who have been following the news, I just want to stipulate that I find these revelations that Chavez not only sexually molested young children, but raped his partner in the activism, Dolores Huerta. I find them devastating. I knew nothing about this. Apparently, it was not unknown in the movement. And I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about that, but I certainly knew nothing about it. Apparently, earlier historians who have written about Chavez did write about infidelities in his marriage, that he had a number of children outside his primary family. He had 8 children within his family. Apparently, DNA tests have confirmed this. One of the revelations we had about Dolores Huerta is that Chavez raped her twice, and in each case, she bore a child who is his. So the number of themes in this particular scandal, tragedy are huge. One of the things we have seen in response to the revelations is the cancellation of Cesar Chavez Day, which is traditionally a day where we not just celebrate the man, but celebrate the farm workers movement. For those of you who don't know much about the history of the movement, and boy, I wish Eladio was here right now, it was a very difficult campaign because migrant workers are traditionally very hard to organize, much like home care workers are very difficult to organize, or laundry worker unions. A friend of mine from graduate school named Ren Shu Yu wrote a book about laundry workers unions in New York. Why? Because there's no central workplace that is enduring over a period of years. So the kinds of relationships that you need to organize workers have to be built across tremendous geographies. And when we're talking about farm workers in the Western United States, we're talking about people who traveled thousands of miles going from crop to crop, often returning to the same work sites, but people who were also treated very poorly. One of the things that was very controversial about Chavez, and that we probably need to have a new conversation about, is that he was adamant about keeping undocumented farm workers out of the country. And that is because undocumented people were so much more vulnerable, so much more migratory, that it was very difficult it made the task of organizing far more difficult. Okay, so one aspect of Chavez that we want to put a pin in is his um, position in the history of labor organizing against undocumented workers. Now, that put him at odds with earlier, often communist inspired movements like the CIO, which basically said organize everyone, but also subsequent movements like the SEIU. Again, organize everyone, organize the janitors, organize the people who wash dishes, that the more labor you have organized, the stronger labor is. So Chavez's movement is different from that. That's worth thinking about. The second thing that is worth thinking about here is the tremendous amount of power that Chavez had. It was a very top-down movement. Unlike other civil rights movement, and the farm workers movement was absolutely a civil rights movement, the Farm Workers Union was really led very much from the top. But that top was two people. One was Chavez and one was Dolores Huerta. And Dolores Huerta was revered, not just in the farm workers movement, but in the feminist movement and across the country in the civil rights community. She's now in her 80s, I think. And her revelations that she was raped by Chavez have a kind of extra poignancy from that perspective. So do the two women who have come forward who are in their 60s who say that Chavez groomed them, molested them, raped them when they were children. So one of the things that this intersects with, from my perspective, is the Me Too movement. And apparently one of the women who had been molested by Chavez put something on her Facebook like 10 years ago when Me Too was kind of at its height, saying that this had happened. And she later removed the post. So here he is,
I'm here. I'm
Eladio.
so sorry. I don't know what was going on.
Well, don't worry about it. We're so happy to have you here because I have been doing all this history that I'm not the expert in, but you are.
I'm sure you're
Uh,
doing great.
well, I was doing my best. Eladio, I was about to sort of launch into the ways in which the Chavez revelations intersects with the feminist movement, but I want to put that off for now. Just to introduce you to my audience, you are an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. As I said earlier, for those of you who have just joined, Eladio won the Herbert Gutman Prize for his dissertation. And I speculated that this book, which is coming out at the end of April, is a revision of your dissertation. Is that correct?
That is correct.
It's a very serious revision of the dissertation, and beautifully written, Eladio. I just
Thank
want
you.
to compliment you on that. Can you talk to us a little bit about the farm workers movement and Chavez's position as a labor leader? Why is he similar to and different from other civil rights leaders?
Yeah, so Cesar Chavez became the face of the movement, obviously after the late '60s and the struggles of that period. But he was far from even the original. Y- you know, he wasn't the first person to begin this movement. It was actually Filipino workers who started this
Mhm.
movement and then asked him to join, and asked the Mexican Americans to join. But, to get back at I think the core question is what makes him and what was the first part of your question? I'm sorry. I'm still a little flustered from not being able to log in,
Of course you are. I feel that way about
but I'm here
technology
now.
all the time. The first part of my question was, how does the farm workers movement differ as a civil rights movement from
Sure.
other civil rights movement, and specifically, say, the Black civil rights movement that
Sure.
precedes it?
Yeah, that's a great place to start this conversation, I think, and it comes out of the Black civil rights movement. It owes so much to the struggles of Black folks because, as laws are changing, as society is changing, Mexican Americans and, as I mentioned, Filipino workers, these farm workers who had never had a voice or never
Mhm.
really had a chance, suddenly feel that the world around them is changing, that there are opportunities opening up, that
Right.
conversations are emerging, and they see this opening that owes a great debt of gratitude to the Black civil rights struggle. So it comes at around the same time, and that's no coincidence. Again, these workers see themselves in the struggles of Black folks in the South. They see themselves in the struggles of other marginalized people, and they see a
Mhm.
moment where they feel they can make some strides. Finally, it also is important that around the same time, the Bracero program ends, and I can explain what that is for folks who may not know about it. But essentially, hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of guest workers are brought into the country after World War II, or during World War II, and then after World War II. And that for years makes it impossible for farm workers to make strides. The moment that farm workers start to organize, employers do what they do, which is bring in strike breakers,
Right.
typically braceros. And again, the end of the Restore program is no coincidence. It's also because the civil rights movement is taking place and it's making serious strides, and that is part of what causes that program to finally be abolished. But so that's the context. And so by the 1960s, these farm workers who didn't have access to clean water, didn't have breaks, were working back-breaking jobs with no dignity, with terrible working conditions, see an opening, see a moment where they can finally make some strides. So that's how
Mm.
the movement begins. And again, it's initially Filipino workers who walk out. They ask Mexican American workers to join them. They do. And that's where we begin this story. But that's also where it gets really messy.
Okay, so we're going to talk about how it gets really messy in a minute. Um, but one of the things I'd like to sort of put a pin in here is the Bracero program is something important for people to know about
Right,
because there are some Republicans who would like to bring something similar to it back. In other words, people come to this country as guest workers and then they have to leave. And of
right,
course, the tragic end of the Bracero program is hundreds of thousands of people being forcibly deported in an ugly government attack that was nicknamed, well, I guess it was officially called Operation Wetback. And
mm,
wetback is a slur for Mexican Americans
right.
who are not documented to be in this country. So we need to remember that when Republicans talk about guest worker programs as a possible solution to the labor issues in this country, that there's a history there and it's not one that favors workers, right?
Not at all. No, and there was a logic again to the push to end Bracero importation, but largely Mexican Americans who were concerned about what it was doing to them.
Right,
Again, they were beginning to make strides, and the moment they do, these Braceros are brought in huge numbers to break strikes. So this begins right at the beginning of the war and World War II, and it's supposed to end with the war.
right.
Of course, what happens is it actually becomes much larger after the war. Employers become addicted to cheap labor, and the government is unresponsive to the concerns of these Mexican Americans and others who are doing labor work. So yeah, as you mentioned, by the 1950s, there's a panic. It's mostly about the fear of too many Mexicans in the country. That's ultimately what kind of pushes for the government to do something about this.
Right.
It's much less a concern about workers. I mean, Mexican Americans are making logical and reasonable claims about what it's doing to them and to their work and their wages. But ultimately, what pushes the government to do something about it is nativism.
Mhm.
Of course, some Mexican Americans are grateful that it's finally happening. This is a really messy and complicated moment. Um, and I should say that Operation Wetback, and you're right, it's a slur. And I always, when I teach about this, I make clear that I don't use slurs in the classroom for obvious reasons. This one is tricky because it's what they called it,
Right.
and again, that's no surprise. But Operation Wetback was, in some ways, an extremely brutal deportation campaign. People were put on cattle trains. They were put on ships that were sometimes described as having slave ship-like conditions. Really horrendous stuff. But the larger part of this was actually not so much deportation, but legalization.
Mhm,
Um, uh, it was a spectacle. It was theater. It was something that the government did to sell to the American people the vision that, look, we took care of all of these illegals. They're gone. And what typically happened instead was that tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands or more of these workers were either paroled, as they called it, essentially given a piece of paper that says you're no longer illegal. You're now a bracero,
mhm,
but stick around, right? We want this work, we want this labor.
right,
Many of them were deported with the understanding, the implicit understanding that they would just return, sometimes within days.
right,
And the government could sell again to the American people this vision that, look, immigration, illegal immigration is over. We don't have to worry about this. And we all know the story, right? We never talk
mhm,
about immigration again. Of
right,
course, that's not what happens. What happens is labor continues to come in. This is ultimately a matter of supply and demand. There's tons of supply of labor, and the demand is growing, if anything, after
right.
1954. But in
Okay.
that moment, there's this moment where what appears to be a mass deportation campaign takes place.
Okay, so again, mass deportation, and we can make the comparison and see similarities and differences. The
Hmm.
similarities in the spectacular quality of it, but a difference in that the Trump administration in this moment is saying we are deporting people and they're never coming back.
Yeah.
Ever. We are sealing the border. We are putting this technology in place. I mean, and people should know a great deal of the so-called border wall is actually technology and surveillance
Mhm.
techniques,
Yeah.
which we should think about how those might be used in the lives of all Americans
Mhm.
as well, just not at the border. So we've got that. So Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta become the leaders of a movement to organize farm workers more generally. Okay.
Mhm.
So it's mixed ethnicities in many ways, but this is also seen as very much an outcome of Chicano politics, activism, awareness. In fact, the word Chicano gets invented around this time, right?
Yeah, this it's one of those words that initially was used as a term of derision. It comes from, we think, there's still disagreement linguistically about where it comes from, but Chicano, meaning Mexicano, gets sort of
Mhm.
morphs into Chicano, and it is around this time, and in fact, Cesar Chavez's movement often is credited with if not inventing the movement, if not beginning the movement, giving it real life.
Right.
Right? And the irony is then that a lot of Chicanos become concerned about what Cesar Chavez is doing, the way he's approaching his movement, and especially the treatment of the undocumented. But yeah, the Chicano movement begins right around this time, and again, Chavez often gets credit for becoming the face of the movement, if not the one who begins it.
Okay. So I wanted to have this sort of big platform before we talked seriously about the dynamics within the movement that did not just permit Chavez to abuse women, but kept it hidden for decades, for, it seems like about 60 years. I mean,
Yeah.
two of the women, as I mentioned to the audience earlier, who are making these charges are now in their mid 60s. Dolores Huerta, who we all revere. I mean, feminists revere her.
Yeah, rightly so.
She's a saint within the
Right.
movement. She's in her 80s,
Yeah.
right?
Uh, the
And
90s, I think, right? She
90s. And
Yeah,
she has revealed that two of her children were the result of being raped by Chavez, which is a revelation that is just kind of seared into my brain as
yeah,
something so profoundly cruel.
yeah.
And I had not thought of Chavez in this way, but I am not a deep scholar in the movement. Eladio, can you talk to our audience a little bit about what people knew, when they knew it, and what the politics of silence around this are?
Sure, I'll do my best. That's a tough conversation to have,
Yeah.
as we all are finding out. Well, the sexual assault, rape, allegations, um, are not something that I or I think anyone else who's been studying the movement knew anything about. It does seem to have emerged fairly recently. It looks like this was being discussed in some smaller circles for a few years, and then when the report, the New York Times report came out, that seems to have led Huerta to tell her own story.
Right.
So that aspect of it has is new, um, and I can't imagine too many people knew about this other than perhaps the survivors.
Right.
Um, the larger context, the larger demons that Cesar Chavez represented, frankly, have been known for some time. So when I heard about this, I was obviously deeply troubled, disgusted, um, shocked, but not entirely surprised.
Hmm.
So for decades, people have been speaking out about abusive behavior, about the ways in which Chavez behaved around not just women, but people generally, people he initially sometimes considered allies and assets. But when they questioned his tactics, were pushed out of the movement, careers were ruined, lives were ruined. And I think you could argue that the movement suffered tremendously. I don't know if I would say that the movement was ruined entirely. There a lot of good has come out of this movement. My
Right.
parents are farm workers or were, they're retired now, but I saw them break their bodies, right, in the fields. I saw how much they had to go through. I also understood how much, better their conditions were relative to those in the 1950s, 60s.
Right.
So a lot of good has come of it. But the movement itself, has always been messy, and Chavez's, role within this movement has always had a really dark side. And again, this is not new. People were speaking out in the 60s and 70s, through the 80s.
Right.
Critics emerged. More recently, right, historians and journalists Miriam Powell, Matt Garcia, and others, Marshall Gans, many of whom were part of the movement, were very close to the movement, began to write critically about Chavez. And that was a massive historiographical and social and cultural shift because for so long Chavez was seen as the saint of the movement, not
Right.
just a saint, but the guy that was at the core and at the center of the entire movement. And you couldn't talk about the movement without talking about Chavez. Even as there were clear patterns of abuse and really awful behavior on his part that were well documented back in the 70s,
Right.
and more recently. But yeah, men and women have been talking about the cult-like behavior that emerged out of this movement as Cesar Chavez became kind of the sole and leading figure of the movement. Um, that there we can talk about the immigrant stuff, the immigration stuff, which is what I focus on, but there were other moments and other instances of Chavez behaving in deeply troubling ways, purging people who disagreed with him. Again, ruining careers, moving people around so that they couldn't have these tough conversations. Sometimes alienating himself from the movement, physically moving himself away from the movement,
Right.
which was deeply troubling to a lot of folks, which was concerning to other movement leaders. And until his death in the early 90s, it was all about Chavez. The
Hmm.
movement was Chavez, and to this day, we have it was where I grew up, certainly, and other parts of the country too. We have schools named after Chavez. We have streets, parks, many of which are now rethinking their associations. Statues are coming down, names are being replaced. But I find that odd that there was lots of well documented evidence that Chavez was a deeply troubled individual,
Right.
who behaved in monstrous ways sometimes, and yet he continued to be seen as a saint and as the figure in the movement instead of one of the figures, instead of a founder. There were other founders, there were other people who were there, and we forget all of them because we focus so much on Chavez.
Right. Well, and I can't help but draw the comparison, and I want to get back to Chavez himself and this whole
Mhm.
question of public memory in a
Sure.
second. But I can't help but compare to a sizable number of voters who align themselves with Donald Trump, who will in fact acknowledge that he has done terrible things
Right.
and just say, well, it doesn't really matter to me because men are like that. This is particularly endemic, it seems, on the white Christian right. This sense of men as just indescribably flawed, and you have to put up with that. And if they're brilliant in other ways, it's okay. But I don't think it's only the white Christian right. I think we see that. In our continuing memory of Michael Jackson, who I think we know serially molested boys who they were interviewed for a movie, and you could tell by their demeanor that they were deeply traumatized and harmed by it. And yet you go into the Stop and Shop and there's a Michael Jackson song playing. He
Right.
has not been canceled, and there are a range of people who are committed to the idea that Michael Jackson did nothing wrong and these boys were just trying to make money off of him. Similarly, Ron, I think his name was, well, a guy who wrote a big biography of Elvis Presley,
Mm.
wrote a lot about how Elvis's people would reach out to the parents of little girls and say, we want your daughter to come and play with Elvis. And by the way, please have her wear white cotton panties. And they would do it. They would send their children to Graceland.
My God.
So there are a range of people who seem to be able to not get, shall we say, canceled for behavior
Yeah.
like this. And then the move against Chavez has been very, very swift.
Yeah.
Can you talk about where that's coming from and why?
Yeah, yeah, we could talk about that for hours, but the two things. I mean, one, at least two things that I want to quickly touch on. One is you're absolutely right. So there are layers to this, right? And certainly white men in power have the most power and ability to navigate
Right.
power and controversy. And I think that is one way that it is different, right? We've seen, again, as you pointed out, the statues coming down, the names being erased overnight. I mean, literally
Mhm.
overnight, right? The allegations came out, and these names were being wiped off of buildings or statues, wrapped up and taken, I don't know where, but and
Mhm.
that's a good thing. I mean, I think we need to stop idolizing people who do horrific things. It shouldn't be that controversial. But we don't see that with other figures, right? With
Right.
white men who are known to be abusive, who we have
Slaveholders,
tons
for
of evidence.
example.
Right, right. But we have decades, so
Right.
there's centuries of evidence of horrific, awful things they've done, physical, sexual violence. We have well documented evidence, and their statues are still outside our buildings. So that is one way in which it's different. And none of that is to suggest that someone like Chavez should get a pass. That we have our own problems within our community, right? Machismo is a real issue. And I think that's part of the story why someone like Chavez got away with this behavior for so
Right.
long.
Right.
In addition to that, there aren't that many positive role models for young brown men. And there actually are, but not ones that are well known. I always, tell people. I wrote a piece a little while ago on the Progressive about Bert Corona and how if you want a, a role model, if you want a hero, look to someone like Bert Corona. Look to someone like
Mhm.
Dolores Huerta. Look to the many women and men who were active in the movement and didn't take the credit or the glory. So there are a lot of layers to this, right? There is a real serious problem with machismo and machista culture and in my own sort of ethnic group. And there are larger structural issues, of course, that layer race and gender in really fascinating and sometimes deeply disturbing ways. So yeah, I mean the allegations are horrific, and they certainly warrant a real moment of soul searching within
Right.
the farm worker movement, within the Latino community. And also, we should ask why don't we have this reaction with so many other powerful white men?
Right. And, another comparison I would make, and all of these listeners, are inexact, but with the ongoing rolling scandal in the Catholic Church
Mm,
over the sexual molestation of boys and girls, that there were often a great many people who would take it seriously enough to say, okay, we have to move this priest somewhere
right.
else, but they didn't take it seriously enough to make it stop, and they didn't take it seriously enough to reorganize the structure of the church to make
Mhm,
sure that children were not being exposed to people who were known to hurt children.
right.
And so there's another piece of this where I just have to say my cynicism about the possibility for powerful people in general to take the pain of children seriously seems like almost zero. Like we're able to do it when we're making a political campaign out
Mm,
of it, but we're
right.
not able to do it in relation to ordinary people. And of course, poor children have always been some of the most vulnerable to sexual
Yeah,
violence, right? And these were
right.
very poor children.
Yeah, yeah, and there are connections there too. I mean, Cesar Chavez was known to have a quasi-religious obsession with the movement. If you look at the the great many number of historical photos of marches, you'll see, Catholic iconography right up front, Virgin of Guadalupe and crosses and Christian imagery. Um, and in fact, I think for many folks, the reason that some folks left the movement was they felt it was becoming a religious movement and something of a cult.
Hmm.
It After 1973, it didn't really resemble a labor struggle at all. It
Interesting.
resembled, um, well, just that, a cult,
Yeah.
and much of it, came from Chavez's own deeply Catholic uh, tradition, or his obsession with Catholicism. So there are links there, and I think that those sorts of links generate a way of viewing the world that is seriously destructive, and that allow people in power to get away with horrendous behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Eladio, what should we do at this moment? I mean, I think one of the problems with our media environment right now, that everything sort of spreads so quickly, is you sort of want to say to everybody, stop. We need to have some time to have a conversation. We need some time to think about what we're supposed to do next. Um, if we had that time, if we could make the media spectacle stop for a day, what would you want people to talk and think about in relation to these devastating revelations?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we need to do is listen, right? And I've been a little bit skeptical of saying too much about this particular story or these stories coming out because I'm not sure that you need another man's voice in this conversation, right? Um, but so I think the first thing we need to do is listen to victims and survivors,
Right.
to try to pin down what exactly happened to the degree that these folks, these women, and many of them who were girls at the time, want to and wish to share their stories, to listen and understand what happened, to hear them and take their stories and their pain seriously, um, and do some serious soul searching about what it is that we have done for decades with these icons and figures, and what we have not done. To look at all again the moments where we should have held them to some account, where people in relative positions of power should have called them out, should have been more active in resisting that behavior and not enabling it. Because again, as autocratic as Chavez became, he couldn't have risen to that degree of power without
Right.
enablers. Many of them his family. I mean, Manuel Chavez was known to be a serious abuser. I don't know if there are sexual assault allegations. I've never seen anything of the sort. But again, there's a lot we don't know. But he was an abuser. He abused people within the movement. He pushed them out. He ruined people's lives and careers because they dared to criticize the Chavez family. So there's a historical record of failures,
Mhm.
obviously of the behavior itself, but also of people who could have done something about it and never did.
Right.
And then, being a historian, we need to learn about the past. We need to learn from others and about others. If nothing else comes out of this for the broader movement, obviously we want justice for the women who suffered at the hands of Chavez, um, who were subjected to sexual violence. That has to be front and center. When we look at the broader lessons, I think we really need to think about all the people and all uh, the organizers we've forgotten. Again,
Right.
because we've put so much weight on Chavez, that it's so easy to forget the work of mostly young women and men at the time who were putting themselves on the line, their bodies, their lives on the line for the movement, so that farm workers could have a more dignified existence. Um, the many people who criticized Chavez, who saw a pattern of abuse, who saw a pattern of failure, and who constantly and consistently asked him to rethink his strategies and and the ways that he approached the problems facing farm workers at the time. Um, those voices are almost non-existent, and even in the more recent works that pay more critical attention to the movement, much of it is focused on what went wrong, right?
Mhm.
Uh, where the movement failed, where Chavez fell short, and that's good. But there are also lots of stories of folks who had better ideas, creative thinking, who understood what could have been approached differently, and that gets lost too. So there are
Mhm.
also lots of lessons about what could have gone right or what did go right in some instances that we sort of forget because we're so focused on icons and single figures that we pretend are the movement when they were just part of it.
Right. Right. Well, and one of the things I noticed in the New York Times piece that originally broke the story is that actually there is stuff in the Chavez archive, which I think is at Wayne State,
Yeah.
that speaks to these issues
Mm. Yeah.
that have been revealed
Yeah.
about sexual abuse. And one of the things it suddenly made me rethink is some of my audience know I'm writing a biography of Susan Brown Miller, the radical feminist. But one of the things that Brown Miller did is she began a sort of organized anti-pornography movement on the East Coast that was modeled on one that had started on the West Coast. And one of the things I noticed when I was researching it is how many of these anti-pornography feminists, white women, had come out of the farm workers movement. That there
That's
were
fascinating.
all of these white women and my thought about that was, well, that was their civil rights struggle in
Mm.
California, because of course what we see in the East is a lot of white women who are involved with CORE and with SNCC and so on, and
Yeah.
they migrate into women's liberation, often carrying grievances with them about how they were treated in the movement. So I was kind of looking at this and I thought, well, this is just, they got their organizing chops in the farm workers movement and then they became feminists.
Mhm.
But all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, why anti pornography feminists? Why were they so involved with sexual violence
Mhm.
specifically? And I can't even believe I'm saying this because I am working so hard to finish this book. There's a part of me that thinks, I need to get my behind out to Wayne State and see if any
Right.
of these organizers that I have tracked are actually in the archive, and what is it that happened to them in the movement,
Right.
if anything. Um, so I would say a little piece of this for me is opening up another connection with
Yeah.
broader progressivism. Yeah,
Yeah, and asking the right questions because you're right. I
yeah,
think all of us go into these projects focused on certain aspects of our movements, or
right.
some with Chavez. Once he becomes the face of the movement, then everyone's writing about Chavez. Everyone's writing
Hmm.
about Chavez's strategies.
Hmm.
Eventually, we get to where we write about his mistakes and his tactical errors or his organizational limits. and that's good, but we're still focused on this very narrow topic or sometimes
Yeah.
very narrow figures. We're missing everyone else, and so we're sometimes asking the wrong questions. And so I
Yeah.
I hope again that whatever good comes of this, for at least the larger movement, we start to ask better questions. We discipline ourselves better as historians and thinkers about the kinds of questions we pay attention to, the kinds of people we pay attention to, the kinds of research that we do, and really pay attention to those figures that we often forget, because sometimes they have really important stories to tell. And you're right, there's probably tons of stuff in there that now will make a lot of sense to a lot of
Right.
people that maybe people didn't pay attention to or wanted to ignore. And uh, yeah, the documents are often there, and we just need to make sense of them
Yeah.
and bring them to light.
Yeah, and, I would hope that at least some of the municipalities that are tearing down the Cesar Chavez signs will consider replacing them with, memorials to Dolores Huerta,
Mm,
and others in the movement, because I don't wanna see this activism disappear from our public
right.
spaces, from our histories, to be written off in some terrible way.
Mm,
And, we might rethink, you know, what does it look like to create memorials to what women have sacrificed and what women have done in the name
yeah.
of principle and goodness and decency, and what they've endured. Eladio, thank you so much for joining us today. I
Thank you.
really appreciate it. I'm sorry about the technical
No, I'm
difficulties at
sorry.
the beginning,
Yeah.
but it was worth everything. And I
Thank
hope
you.
you will come back on the Substack at some time in the future. You have so much to offer.
Oh, anytime. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
See you soon.
See you.